The microphone clicked live at 11:13 Pacific Time, August 11, 1984. Ronald Reagan leaned into the boom, reading copy for a radio sound check. Studio air conditioning hummed. The technician gave a thumbs up. The president smiled and said, in that warm California drawl, "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." Laughter in the booth. The engineer grinned. The president chuckled. The tape rolled. 47 minutes later, a Soviet signals intelligence station on the Kamchatka Peninsula intercepted the transmission during a routine sweep of American military frequencies. The operator, Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Petrov, froze. He rewound the tape, played it again, translated the words into Russian on his notepad, read them a third time. Then he reached for the red phone. Within 90 seconds, the intercept was on a secure teletype to Moscow. Within 4 minutes, it was on the desk of Marshal Nikolai Ogakov, chief of the Soviet General Staff. Within 6 minutes, it was in front of General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko. And within 8 minutes, Soviet strategic rocket forces across 11 time zones received a flash alert. Boyevaya gotovnost povchena. Combat readiness elevated. Here is the paradox that should not exist. A joke told in a California radio studio nearly triggered the automatic launch protocols of the most destructive weapons system ever built. Not because of malice, not because of error, but because two superpowers had constructed a strategic architecture so tightly wound, so automated, so dependent on speed and preemption that it could no longer distinguish between a laugh and a launch order. This is the story of how that system was built, why it interpreted humor as Holocaust, and what that 5-minute joke revealed about the invisible tripwires holding the world hostage. But first, you need to understand what Soviet intelligence was hearing in the summer of 1984, and why they had every reason to believe the joke was real. If you want to understand how close we came to the edge and how the systems we built to prevent war nearly caused it, stay with this story. Because what happened next wasn't written in any contingency plan. The Soviet Union in August 1984 was not paranoid. It was calculating, and its calculations were based on a decade of American strategic behavior that looked, from Moscow, like preparation for a first strike. Start with November 1983. NATO had just conducted Able Archer 83, the most realistic nuclear war exercise in alliance history. For 9 days, NATO forces across Europe simulated the transition from conventional war to full nuclear release. They used new encrypted communication protocols. They moved actual command units to wartime positions. They practiced the authorization procedures for tactical and strategic weapons, and they did it all under radio silence, so Soviet intelligence couldn't track the exercise in real time. The KGB and GRU watched this through their networks and saw something else, the perfect cover for an actual attack. If you were going to launch a surprise nuclear strike, you would disguise it as an exercise right up until the moment the missiles flew. The Soviets had wargamed this exact scenario. They knew NATO knew they had wargamed it. The epistemological loop was complete. Soviet intelligence went to alert status. Some air units in East Germany and Poland were quietly armed with nuclear weapons. Command posts were manned around the clock. And in Moscow, the Politburo asked the question that had no good answer. If NATO were preparing a real first strike, what would look different from what we're seeing now? The answer was nothing. The signature of an exercise and the signature of an attack were identical until the warheads left the silos. Then came the spring of 1984. The United States deployed Pershing II ballistic missiles to West Germany. These were not like the older systems. The Pershing II had a range of 1,800 kilometers and a flight time to Moscow of less than 10 minutes. It carried a maneuverable re-entry vehicle with accuracy measured in meters, not kilometers. It was designed to destroy hardened command bunkers in a decapitation strike. And it was based so close to Soviet borders that Moscow's early warning system would have almost no time to detect a launch, assess the threat, and authorize retaliation. From the Soviet perspective, the Pershing II inverted the entire logic of deterrence. For 2 decades, mutual assured destruction had rested on a simple assumption. Both sides would see an attack coming in time to launch their own missiles before they were destroyed. That mutual vulnerability created stability. But the Pershing II, with its speed and precision, threatened to destroy Soviet command and control before they could respond. It made a first strike thinkable. Soviet military doctrine changed accordingly. In classified briefings throughout 1984, Soviet rocket force commanders were told to assume that any ambiguous signal from NATO could be the leading edge of a decapitation strike. They were told that decision timelines had collapsed. They were told that in a crisis, they might have less than 6 minutes from detection to launch authorization. And they were told that if they waited for certainty, they would wait until their silos were glass. This was the strategic environment on August 11, 1984. The Soviet Union was not looking for reasons to relax. It was looking for confirmation of its worst-case assumptions, and its intelligence apparatus was tuned to a frequency where jokes and threats sounded identical. So when Senior Lieutenant Petrov's intercept landed in Moscow, it didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in a system primed to interpret ambiguity as aggression. The transcript was analyzed by 3 separate directorates within 2 hours. The first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, confirmed the voice was Reagan's. The GRU Signals Analysis Section confirmed the transmission originated from a known US military communications relay. The third directorate, responsible for military counterintelligence, noted that the phrase "we begin bombing in 5 minutes" matched the syntax of authenticated US emergency action messages. But here's what made the joke lethal. It was never broadcast publicly. It was a sound check recorded on a live microphone that was supposed to be isolated from transmission. The Soviets intercepted it on a military frequency, not a civilian one. So, from their perspective, this wasn't a public gaffe. It was a private communication between the president and US military command infrastructure, accidentally leaked onto a channel they happened to be monitoring. In other words, it looked exactly like what you would say if you were about to do it. The Soviet General Staff convened an emergency session at 1440 Moscow time. Marshal Ogakov opened the meeting with a single question. Is this a provocation, a mistake, or a warning? No one in the room could answer with certainty. And that was the problem. The system they had built did not require certainty. It required speed. Soviet nuclear doctrine in 1984 operated on a concept called launch on warning. If early warning radars detected incoming missiles, Soviet forces were authorized to launch their own missiles before the incoming warheads arrived. This was not optional. It was necessitated by the fact that a successful first strike could destroy so many Soviet missiles in their silos that retaliation would be impossible. The only way to guarantee retaliation was to launch before your weapons were destroyed. But launch on warning created a new problem. It compressed decision-making to the point where human judgment became a bottleneck. If you had 6 minutes from detection to impact and it took 4 minutes to transmit launch orders and spin up the missiles, you had 2 minutes to decide whether the warning was real. 2 minutes to determine whether the radar blip was a missile, a satellite, a meteor, or a malfunction. 2 minutes to choose between global annihilation and national suicide. The Soviets had tried to solve this with automation. By 1984, they had developed a system called Perimeter, known in the West as Dead Hand. Perimeter was designed to ensure retaliation even if the Soviet leadership was destroyed in a first strike. It used a network of sensors to detect nuclear detonations on Soviet soil. If those sensors registered attacks, and if communication with the Soviet leadership was lost, Perimeter would automatically send launch orders to all remaining missile silos. The system could function with minimal human input. In theory, it made Soviet retaliation inevitable. In practice, it made accidental retaliation almost inevitable. Because Perimeter didn't just respond to mushroom clouds, it responded to indicators. And in August 1984, the indicators were flashing. Able Archer 83 had been an indicator. The Pershing II deployments were an indicator. Increased NATO communication security was an indicator. And now, a recorded statement from the President of the United States saying we begin bombing in 5 minutes was an indicator. The system didn't need to know it was a joke. It just needed to know it fit the pattern. At 1510 Moscow time, Soviet strategic rocket forces received orders to move to increased readiness. This was not full alert. It was one level below. But it meant that missile crews were now at their consoles, authentication codes were distributed, and the time from launch order to missile ignition had been reduced from 15 minutes to 4. Soviet ballistic missile submarines in the Arctic and Pacific received similar orders. Attack submarines shadowing US carrier groups were told to close to firing range. Air defense networks across the Soviet Union went to wartime posture, which meant that any unidentified aircraft would be engaged without warning. And in bunkers beneath the Ural Mountains, the perimeter system was brought to active standby. It was not armed, but it was listening. None of this was visible to the United States. American intelligence detected some increased Soviet communications activity, but it was not dramatic enough to trigger alarms. The US had no idea that a radio sound check had just put the Soviet nuclear arsenal on a hair trigger. But here's the detail that makes this story unbearable. The Soviets didn't tell anyone what they were reacting to. Not because of secrecy, but because their doctrine assumed the Americans already knew. If the US was preparing a first strike, of course they would know the Soviets were responding. And if the US wasn't preparing a strike, then Soviet readiness moves would deter them from starting one. Either way, silence was the correct move. So now you had two nuclear superpowers, each operating on threat models that assumed the other was behaving rationally, but defining rationality in mutually incompatible ways. The Americans thought the Soviets understood the difference between a sound check and a war plan. The Soviets thought the Americans understood that jokes about bombing Russia were indistinguishable from intent. And the system that was supposed to prevent war was now amplifying a misunderstanding into a crisis. The Soviet readiness increase lasted for 4 hours and 18 minutes. It was quietly scaled back after signals. Intelligence confirmed that US strategic forces had not changed posture, that no unusual bomber activity had been detected, and that the phrase "we begin bombing in 5 minutes" had now appeared on Western news broadcasts as a gaffe, not a leak. But the stand-down was not immediate, it was gradual, because Soviet doctrine required them to consider the possibility that the public broadcast was itself a deception, designed to make them lower their guard before the real attack. This is the epistemological trap of nuclear deterrence. Once you assume your adversary is capable of deception, every piece of evidence can be interpreted as either truth or lie. A joke can be a joke, or it can be cover for a joke. A stand-down can be a stand-down, or it can be bait. And the only way to be certain is to wait until the missiles are in the air, at which point certainty is irrelevant. The Soviet General Staff did not formally brief the Politburo on the August 11th alert until 3 days later. When they did, Chernenko asked the same question Ogakov had asked. Was this a provocation, a mistake, or a warning? Ogakov's answer is preserved in a declassified GRU summary. It was all three. The Americans provoked us with careless language. They made a mistake in not securing their communication, and they warned us, intentionally or not, that they do not take the possibility of war seriously. That is the most dangerous warning of all. The Americans, meanwhile, had no idea any of this had happened. The Reagan administration learned about the Soviet alert not from their own intelligence, but from a KGB defector who mentioned it in a debriefing 18 months later. When the CIA briefed the president, Reagan was reportedly stunned. He had not considered that a joke could be weaponized by the system he commanded. But the system didn't care about intent. It cared about signals. And the signal it received was unambiguous. The President of the United States had joked about starting a nuclear war at the exact moment when Soviet doctrine interpreted jokes as threats. Now we arrive at the two variables that explain why this near miss was inevitable and why it will happen again unless the variables change. Variable 1. Compression of decision time. In 1960, the flight time of an intercontinental ballistic missile from the Soviet Union to the United States was approximately 35 minutes. That gave both sides a window to assess, communicate, and decide. By 1984, with the deployment of submarine-launched missiles and intermediate-range systems like the Pershing II, flight times had collapsed to as little as 6 minutes for some targets. The human brain cannot reliably distinguish a real attack from a false alarm in 6 minutes, especially when the cost of a wrong guess is national extinction. So both sides automated the process. They built systems that could detect, assess, and respond faster than humans could think. And those systems could not understand context. They could not detect sarcasm. They could not distinguish a sound check from a strike order. Variable 2. Doctrine of preemption. Both the US and Soviet Union had adopted strategies that required them to strike first if they believed an attack was imminent. For the Soviets, this was launch on warning. For the Americans, it was counterforce targeting, the idea that you could destroy the enemy's missiles before they launched. Both doctrines were logical responses to the technological reality of nuclear weapons. But both doctrines created a perverse incentive. The side that struck first had a massive advantage, so both sides built systems optimized for speed, not accuracy. They built systems that rewarded rapid response and punished hesitation. And they built systems that could not be recalled once the process started. Put those two variables together, and you get a machine that is faster than human judgment and more paranoid than human fear. You get a system where a joke can be interpreted as a launch order, and a launch order can be executed before anyone realizes it was a joke. The Reagan joke was not an anomaly, it was a stress test. And the system failed. Here's the moment that should haunt every person who thinks nuclear deterrence is stable. On September 26, 1983, less than a year before Reagan's joke, a Soviet early warning satellite detected 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles launching from the United States. The system was called OKO. It was designed to give the Soviet Union 25 minutes of warning before impact. It was automated. It was reliable. And on September 26th, it reported with high confidence that the United States had just launched a nuclear first strike. The alert went to Serpukhov 15, a bunker south of Moscow where Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer. Petrov had less than 5 minutes to assess the alert and decide whether to forward it up the chain of command. If he forwarded it, Soviet doctrine required an immediate retaliatory launch. If he didn't forward it and the alert was real, the Soviet Union would be destroyed without firing a shot. Petrov looked at the data. 5 missiles. Not hundreds, not thousands. 5. He thought, if the Americans are launching a first strike, why would they only launch 5 missiles? It made no sense. A real first strike would be overwhelming. This looked like a malfunction. He did not forward the alert. He reported it as a system error, and he was right. The satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile plumes. The system had been fooled by the sun. Petrov was reprimanded for not following protocol. He was reassigned. He received no official recognition for preventing a nuclear war. because officially he had done nothing. The system was supposed to be reliable. The system was not supposed to make mistakes. And if the system made a mistake, the correct response was to follow the system anyway, because the cost of ignoring a real attack was higher than the cost of launching on a false one. That is the logic of preemption. That is the logic that interpreted Reagan's joke as a threat. And that is the logic that will, sooner or later, kill us all unless we dismantle it. Because here's the statistic that should end the argument. Between 1977 and 1984, US early warning systems generated 1,152 false alerts of Soviet missile launches. Soviet systems generated a comparable number. Most were resolved in seconds. Some took minutes. A few took long enough that bomber crews were ordered to their aircraft and missile crews were told to prepare for launch. In every case, a human being made the decision to wait, to double-check, to assume the system was wrong, and in every case, they were right. But the system is designed to make that decision harder every year. Faster missiles, shorter flight times, more automation, less time to think, and every incremental improvement in speed is a reduction in the space for human judgment. Reagan's joke exposed this. It showed that the system could not tolerate ambiguity. It showed that the gap between a laugh and a launch order was not a gap in intent, but a gap in time. And it showed that the people who built the system had not considered that the president might joke about the thing he was supposed to prevent. The joke was broadcast on August 11, 1984. The Soviet alert was scaled back by August 12th. And on August 13th, the White House press secretary issued a statement saying the president's remarks were not helpful and that he regretted any misunderstanding. But the misunderstanding was not a bug. It was a feature. The system was designed to misunderstand. It was designed to interpret ambiguity as threat. It was designed to assume the worst and act on that assumption before the assumption could be tested. And the people who designed it knew this. They knew that automation would create false positives. They knew that preemption would reward speed over accuracy. They knew that the system would eventually mistake a joke for a war. But they built it anyway, because the alternative, mutual vulnerability without automation, felt more dangerous than the risk of accidental annihilation. That calculation is still with us. The systems are faster now, the missiles are more accurate, the decision timelines are shorter, and the jokes are still being told. In 2007, a Russian television crew asked Stanislav Petrov what he thought about Reagan's joke. Petrov, who had prevented a nuclear war by ignoring his orders, said, "If I had been on duty on August 11, 1984, and I had received that intercept, I would have reported it. Because it was not my job to decide if the president was joking. It was my job to report what the system detected, and the system detected a threat." That is the answer to the question we started with. Reagan's joke almost started World War III because the system could not afford to assume it was a joke. The system was built to assume it was real and to act on that assumption faster than a human could object. The joke was told in a radio studio in California. It was intercepted on a peninsula in Kamchatka. It was analyzed in Moscow. It was escalated to the general staff. It triggered a readiness increase across 11 time zones. And it was resolved not because the system worked, but because the system hesitated just long enough for a human being to ask, "Does this make sense?" The next time, the system might not hesitate. The next time, the joke might not be a joke. And the next time, there might not be a Stanislav Petrov on duty to ignore the order. Remember the laughter in the radio booth, the engineer grinning, the president chuckling, the microphone live, the tape rolling. And 47 minutes later, a Soviet lieutenant reaching for the red phone. That is the distance between a joke and the end of the world. 47 minutes and a system that could not tell the difference.